the Telegraph and Isabel Oakeshott have released lockdown files exposing the government, Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, and general other members of the government for being absolutely incompetent. Despite all this news coming out that, for example, Boris Johnson was very influenced by public opinion, not the actual science, of what to do when it comes to lockdown, or, for example, how he didn't want to cause an argument with Nicola Sturgeon over masks in schools. And despite all this news coming out, the media seems to be focused on Isabel Oakeshott's betrayal of Matt Hancock.
You're talking about my salary. That's what you've been talking about.
Well, no, I'm not talking about your salary anymore.
With you?
I'm not talking about your salary.
Do you want to talk about your salary?
I want to talk about the story that has played out this week. I wonder if you're.
Kathy?
I haven't hit the headlines. You've hit the headlines, Isabel.
Well, maybe if you broke some stories, you would.
I'm sorry, but when you're doing such atrocious acts, when you're basically destroying people's liberty, restricting people's liberty, I don't think you have a right to say about betrayal. What do you think, Darren?
I mean, I think you raise a good point. If you ask me, Jess, there's a very clear-cut case of public interest in this story. I think Isabel shouldn't be the story. Isabel isn't the story. Ultimately, all she did was bravely breach a non-disclosure agreement, which she signed with Matt Hancock upon writing a book on the so-called pandemic diaries that he wrote with Isabel Oakeshott, which actually is no diary, if you ask me, because it was very, well, maybe it is a diary, but it's a celebrity diary. You know, it's a sort of Katie Price kiss and tell diary, because it's very selective on what it does and doesn't include. Because ultimately, what these leaked WhatsApps have actually revealed about Matt Hancock is that they give us, I think, a real insight into the unprecedented amounts of power that the government used and ultimately abused, right? The power to tell you who you can and cannot have sex with, the power to tell you if you can hug your granny, the power to tell that, well, to terrify you actually into submission, the power to curtail voices of dissent. Remember all the protesters that were kettled and all the rest of it. I guess this, Jess, to me, is an example of the only precedent in history, in our history, certainly living memory, where the kind of powers that were seized by the government would have once rested in the hands of a medieval king, right? So let's consider the language here, Jess, that's come out of some of these these WhatsApp messages, rather. In one set of messages, and by the way, we haven't even scratched the surface yet, it appears. Apparently the Telegraph are currently, as we speak, trawling through these WhatsApp messages in chronological order, what it appears to be in chronological order. And in one set, Jess, Hancock speaks of how he wants to frighten the pants off everyone with this new variant that he wants to deploy. You know, so it's not COVID-19 mutating, the normal aspect of viruses mutating into new and actually, as the trajectory goes on, weaker elements, strains of the virus. Matt Hancock was the one, Jess, that could deploy this virus on the British people like he's in some Wuhan lab. And actually what he meant by that was come up with some scary narrative to terrify us into submission. This tiny, insignificant speck of a man that should be absolutely nowhere near power, never mind health secretary, controlling all of our lives in this way. He's a pathetic excuse of a human being. And I'm absolutely outraged by what's coming out about all of this, Jess. I really, really am.
I mean, the fact that we've seen so much the incompetence of the government just shows why we shouldn't have given these people so much power to begin with. The same people who are just going out on a whim whether to lock people in their homes for months are the same people who want to control every part of our life. And I think knowing the process of like trust the science, protect your grammar, knowing the backstory behind that is quite atrocious. So many people had to suffer during lockdown. Many people's lives were lost because of the government's incompetence, their incompetent guidance, and their draconian measures that realistically, did they actually help? Did they know that it actually helped? I don't think that the government should be making these drastic decisions so easily, so nonchalantly. It's ridiculous.
Exactly, and think about how unpopular we were when we were making these arguments back after the second referendum, the second Freudian slip there, the second lockdown rather. We were making these arguments and we were dismissed as being some kind of COVID idiots, and apparently some of commentators have been placed on lists by the government, suggesting that you can't trust them on the science and all the rest of it. But I mean, just think back to these days, right, when we were all stood like total melons in supermarkets and elsewhere on spaced out footprints, or, you know, locking ourselves away in flats such as this one, or, well, for months on end at certain points, and actually losing precious years in education, at work, or in your personal lives and relationships. And I'm afraid to say that I still believe, since that second lockdown, I still believe that it was all massively disproportionate, and all of these messages really, really do speak to that. The lockdown files show that there was encouragement for the police, for ministers to get heavy. That's not my language, that's their language, to get heavy with the police. Now, if you can remember, Jess, people were arrested for walking outside with coffees. I remember a couple of women who were arrested. Others were issued fines that could run up to a crippling £10,000. And there was an admission here, and I think a pretty open and frank admission, that masks were utterly useless and that they were only there to create a sense of danger and urgency and panic and fear in the hearts of the British people. And I'm glad that all of this is out in the open now, because I actually think, this is why I think Isabel Oakeshott has done the British people a service. I fear that the COVID inquiry will be a complete whitewash, right? And I fear that this all might happen again. Who knows what China are going to cook up in some lab next, right? And I think the same behavioral and psychological submission will be inflicted onto the British people to try and beat us into line. And I don't think that's right in a liberal democracy such as ours, if we can still call ourselves that. You've got Sweden, right? Sweden didn't follow the same hideous measures. And if you look at them now, Jess, they're not experiencing the same excess death phenomenon going on in their healthcare system, because they didn't follow the same measures that have crippled their healthcare system as much as ours. You know, you've got massive backlogs in our system because we had 2 years of basically shutting down the healthcare system for everything other than COVID. And I'm never going to forgive them personally for that. I mean, I don't know if I think I might have said this on this channel before, but I can't really recall. But I have OCD, Jess, and I really suffered during, tiniest violin in the world or what. But I really suffered during that third lockdown, nowhere near as bad as many people did. But I'd convinced myself that I couldn't go back to my flat in London. Tiny flat I'd been in for, nigh on 2 years, locked away. And I convinced myself that something terrible was going to happen in that flat, right? So bad was this OCD that I'd never experienced before in my life. And I had a complete nervous breakdown. And I ended up having to seek help from the Priory, which is a private healthcare provider, via Zoom sessions. Now, not many people can afford to do that sort of thing. So it breaks my heart reading all of these stories about suicides, about self-harm, about domestic violence that really took hold during that time. And personally, I really mean it. I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive them for this. We didn't do this during the Hong Kong flu outbreak in, I think, the 1960s. We didn't react like how we did during the Wuhan virus of COVID-19. We didn't tell the young to stay home then. We didn't risk bankrupting our economy, causing the cost of living crisis that we're all feeling in our pockets today, which will go on for many years now. And I just think it was all wrong, Jess, and this has only strengthened the way that I feel about it and actually emboldened my contempt for the people that inflicted it upon us.